Good afternoon. Welcome to Smithsonian Gardens. Let's Talk Gardens. It's a beautiful day here in Washington, D.C., and I am so glad that everyone is attending so that you can learn how to take better care of your trees. This is an exciting topic. This is brand new, cutting edge, something that I never learned about in horticulture school. So I am so excited to introduce Jake Hendee, and he's Smithsonian Gardens arborist, and he has some fascinating ideas to share with you. As always, please put your questions in the chat box. We will attend to the questions after the presentation. The video will be put on our website by next week, as well as the questions that we were unable to answer today. So thank you all for attending. And thank you, Jake, for coming and enlightening us on this very important topic. I'm going to go ahead and disappear, and I want you to start sharing. Tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you ever found out about this really interesting information you're going to share with us today. I'll see you at the end of your presentation. Bye.
All right, thank you, Cindy, and thank you everyone for joining today. Cindy, I am going to verify that my slides are showing, my audio is working. Please pop in if anything is not working. Otherwise, I will proceed.
You're doing great. You're good. I can hear and see. That's great.
All right. So today I want to talk about an epidemic on our landscape, a woody plant epidemic that is caused by our most basic garden maintenance practices. Today, it's my goal to challenge some beliefs about how gardening, landscaping, tree care are traditionally done, but it's also my goal to give you all the tools to significantly improve the health of your trees, shrubs, and urban forests by just slightly altering sort of your most common garden maintenance tasks that you're doing. So whether you're a homeowner, a renter, a professional horticulturist, whether you're managing a single urban tree box, a small row house yard, a large estate, or a big public space, I think you'll find something in this talk. So the title of today's talk is The Secret to Tree and Shrub Health. Forget everything you've learned about planting and mulching. This talk will absolutely change the way you see the tree world. And some people have told me it's a little bit depressing when you start to see all the problems with how we are growing our woody plants. But again, it's my goal to give you all the tools to fix all that is wrong in the tree world. As a bit of an aside, I presented this as a pest management talk to our garden staff last week. So we'll spend quite a bit of time also talking about how to use best practices in planting, mulching, and the nursery, on how that will make our woody plants resistant to pests and reduce our real or perceived needs for pesticides in our landscapes. So just to outline the talk this morning, I'll start by previewing the 6 primary conclusions that I want you to take home today from the talk. I'll dig into the details after that, framing what happens at the root flare, at the base of the tree, as the most important determinant of whether that tree succeeds or fails. We'll talk about how to fix these issues, looking through the lens of an integrated pest management framework, and then we'll pause for a quick quiz midway through before finishing the discussion about how to fix these systemic issues. I'll also present a little bit of a challenge to you all to use social media to show us what you're doing in your garden and show your social network what you're doing in your garden as related to root flare issues. And then finally, we'll circle back around to review those 6 primary conclusions. As our primary audience for Let's Talk Gardens seems to be a really smart and engaged group of master gardeners and advanced gardeners, the content is aimed at advanced gardeners, but I think everyone will find plenty to take home. Because this was initially developed as a staff training, we may get a little bit technical at times, but stick with me. So our first preview of conclusions to take home is the interrelated complex of traditional and prevailing planting, nursery, and mulching practices are responsible for an epidemic of woody plant decline on our landscape caused by stem girdling roots. In the literature, epidemic is the word that comes up all too often when discussing this interrelated complex of planting, nursery, and mulching issues. And of course, the primary villain, circling and stem girdling roots. When I look at a woody plant in the landscape, trees suffering from these issues are still very much the norm. They are the average tree. They are not the exception. At Smithsonian Gardens, we are as affected as anyone by this epidemic. Most of the photos here come from our campus, and we'll talk a little bit how to prevent these issues of roots circling around the base of our trees and causing health issues. Our second preview of conclusions is root flare management is a critical component of an effective integrated pest management program and critical to the responsible use of pesticides in the landscape. Many tree health problems start at the root flare of the tree down here, but we often see the symptoms as things like a carpet of gloomy scales on this red maple. We'll talk about how to address the root cause, not just put down a bunch of insecticides into the environment addressing the symptom of the problem. Third, mulch kills trees. This is deliberately a little bit of a shot across the bow. Mulch is, of course, great for trees, but in the way that it is applied in the landscape in the vast majority of cases, really across North America, including some of the spaces in our own gardens here at Smithsonian Gardens, it is usually doing more damage than good and not applied according to best practices. The key is that mulch should never be touching the tree, and most importantly, we can avoid many plant health issues if we apply it in a way that will prevent the root flare down here from being buried by mulch. We'll talk about why and how to get the mulch down correctly. Our fourth preview conclusion is that deep planting also kills trees. Most trees are planted way too deeply. When planting a tree or a shrub, a well-defined root flare, not the top of the root ball or the container, but the root flare itself should be planted above the grade and probably above the mulch level too, without exception. We'll talk about why and how to make sure we plant our trees high enough. Our fifth preview of conclusions is that many nursery grown trees and shrubs have poor root systems. Most of the trees that we have the opportunity to buy, and most of the trees that we do buy, have root defects that significantly compromise the outlook for the tree. We'll talk about how to avoid these issues, and where we can't avoid them, how to correct those issues. And then our sixth preview conclusion is that planting, nursery, and mulching issues should be prevented and corrected. As with everything, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So be like Sylvia and Eric. In all planting, nursery purchasing, mulching, find and free the root flare before problems already existing and developing just above the root flare get worse. So we'll talk about these issues not just as a matter of tree health, but as a matter of pest management. Here's my favorite and most concise illustrated example of these issues, something that I see everywhere here in the DC region, the tragedy of the urban red maple in 3 acts. Red maple is one of my favorite trees. People around here don't love it because it's heavily planted. It always seems to be in poor condition, and maybe it's not the easiest tree to garden around either. But I still see rows and rows of these trees, especially street trees, suffering from all of the same issues. So first, we plant the tree too deeply, we mulch it too heavily, and we probably use low-quality nursery trees because that's what's most available. Second, we notice that it has sun scald on the trunk, dieback at the tips, and the sooty color characteristic of gloomy scale, an insect pest, up and down the branches and the trunk. Sometimes there's a canker of dead tissue at the base of the tree, maybe already decaying. And then oftentimes we think about applying an insecticide to eradicate the pest that has showed up, or we just walk away from the tree blaming bad weather, bad luck, or something else, but we don't identify the obvious cause of the decline and the tree continues to struggle. The third act, after only a few years in the landscape, the tree looks terrible, dies or falls over, and we repeat the process again. Again, to sort of summarize that into a quick graphic, we make the same mistakes at planting over and over. The tree develops the same health and pest issues, and then we remove a poor looking tree. And along the way, we'll apply a pesticide to kill the pest, gloomy scale in the case of red maple, but rarely do we address the issues causing the tree, the moisture stress that causes the sun scald and attracts the pest. So I'm going to spend a lot of time in this presentation talking about how we can do more for our plants with a rake and a soil knife than a systemic neonicotinoid insecticide that will also kill the bees too. The same thought process is what drove the concept of integrated pest management to prominence in the 1970s. Over-reliance on chemical controls introduced significant human health and ecological health impacts. And there was a lot of evidence that it wasn't even all that effective anyway. So looking at pest management more holistically includes first monitoring to understand our problems, populations, and trajectories. Second, implementing preventative tactics to prevent oftentimes very foreseeable pest or plant health issues, again, such as our red maple. And then third, implementing the appropriate control tactics that have the most benefits for the least cost and the least risk. We'll talk about root flares, stem girdling roots, planting, nursery, and mulching practices that cause tree and shrub health issues. And we'll talk about them within this integrated pest management framework for the remainder of the presentation. So just to re-summarize the concept of integrated pest management again, over-reliance and over-application of pesticides has ecological and human health risks that we can minimize but not entirely eliminate by proper and conscientious applications of these products. However, we can eliminate any risk at all by utilizing the other integrated pest management tools, such as monitoring, preventative tactics, and other controls such as cultural, mechanical, and biological controls, before we fall back on those chemical controls to smoke that insect, but the insect may not even be causing our problems with plant health to start. So what exactly is the problem? As we sort of hinted at earlier here in the presentation, is that the prevailing common nursery, planting, and mulching practices, that interrelated complex of those three things, encourage roots that circle the base of the tree, such as here, particularly by the mechanism in which the mix of soil and mulch accumulate above the widened root flare of the tree. So with rootable soils elevated around that skinny base of the tree, like this tree right here, roots quickly circle the tree and then embed themselves in the tree as it grows in diameter. These stem girdling roots compress bark and vascular tissue and reduce the vascular conductivity of woody plants. This means water and nutrients can't move from the roots down here up the stem and to the foliage where those water and nutrients are needed. Trees impacted decline, die back, and sometimes just break off at the base, as Janet's photo down here shows. Again, these issues are epidemic. When I drive down the street, the situation of mulch and soil over the root flare is the norm. It is not the exception. We didn't really start talking about stem girdling roots at all until the 1980s. And then professional consensus and best management practices didn't reflect these concerns until the early 2000s. So we have some excuses for the management of our older trees. But now 15, 20 years later, the vast majority of the trees are still not being managed consistent with what we know are best management practices that will significantly improve the health of our trees. So let's break it out by practice. First, in the nursery, deep planting in the nursery leaves soil above the root flare, and that allows roots to grow up around, again, the skinniest part of the base of the tree. Containerized trees in the nursery, grown in black plastic containers that you're familiar with, naturally encourage roots to circle, like this dead tree that we pulled out of the ground in the shape of the container it was grown in. And then to add to that, oftentimes those trees in those containers are often deeply planted and root bound, again, such as this tree, before you even get it to your garden. It's set up to fail. Once we get the tree to the garden, trees are universally planted too deeply in the landscape, again, leaving soil above the root flare for stem girdling roots to proliferate. Several studies have indicated that greater than 90% of, quote, professionally planted trees are planted too deeply, and that's usually way, way, way too deeply. Over mulching, mulch volcanoes, which many of us are familiar with, and mismulching mulch up against the base of the tree, over the top of the root flare, are practices that are widespread and allow roots to grow through the mulch on top of the root flare and circle the skinniest part of the base of the tree above that flare. So just to really emphasize why these issues occur, it's worth looking at how trees grow. We are all familiar with aging a tree by its rings. You can see the rings on this tree. Here's a view of a tree cross section, a photo of that perspective, and then corresponding graphics over here showing that same view of the tree. The first few years, the entire cross section of the tree is made up of conductive sapwood that is moving water nutrients from the roots to the crown. As the tree ages, those cells in the interior clog up, stop working, oftentimes darken like this tree, and then this non-functional interior wood becomes what we know as heartwood. It's not moving any water or nutrients, but it's helping support the tree, but mostly just hanging out inside. So now here's a view of that same tree with a circling root that becomes a stem girdling root over time. Year 5, a root circles around the base of the tree, usually above the root flare. Year 10, that circling root becomes a stem girdling root and begins to compress the tissue. Year 15, the tree cannot grow outward and add new sapwood and vascular tissue, so the tree slowly dies out as that sapwood converts to heartwood and the vascular tissue ceases to exist. This is where you start to see things like leaf scorch, tip dieback, and other signs of tree decline that we'll talk about later. These two bottom photos show that conversion from live functional sapwood, you can see some of that here, to damaged heartwood on this side where it has been compressed by an advanced stem girdling root. So there's no functional vascular tissue on this side of the tree anymore, just this tiny little bit of tissue is all that is moving water from the roots to the crown. So I've been talking about these issues for years, and I still feel like people look at me like I'm a little bit of a crazy person when I talk about them. But it's worth repeating that these practices that we have been talking about and that we will be talking about for the remainder of the presentation have been recognized as best management practices for years. So rather than reading through each of these tree care and nursery standards, I'll summarize. Plant your trees and woody shrubs high enough. Correct those root defects when you're planting your woody plants. Maintain 2 to 4 inches of mulch away from the trunk. And then when you're looking for a tree to purchase, a good nursery tree is one that has a flare at the top of the root ball or the container that those roots are in, and it should be free of circling and stem girdling roots when you view it at the nursery. One of the things I want to say here is that we are a public garden, and we admit that we ourselves have some problems, and we struggle to break some of our old bad habits to implement these best practices. But it's our goal with every time we plant or mulch a tree on a landscape, we want to make sure that we're hitting these best practices on the dot. And we want to talk loudly about what that does for our woody plant health. I'd encourage you to do the same after this talk. So what effects do we see from those stem girdling roots once they occur? Well, we've hinted at that already, but again, first, we lose the functional vascular tissue, which means we see moisture and nutrient stress in the canopy of the tree. Of course, with that comes secondary pests that attack moisture-stressed trees. Second, we see tree structure impacts. Tissue killed by stem girdling roots dies, decays, and sometimes can even cause the tree to fail and fall over. These are not just a problem of single trees, it's a problem for urban forests in that when a large proportion of our trees on our landscape look like this specimen or lack thereof, and not unlike this big, beautiful, mature elm that we're really proud of having on our campus, we lose out on all the benefits of urban trees, shade, aesthetics, reduction in urban heat, island effect, stormwater management, and many more positive benefits of urban forests. So more specifically looking at these moisture stress issues. Of course, as we talked about earlier, the root wraps around the base of the trees. It compresses and constrains that vascular tissue. That shows up as things like leaf scorch, this burn around the edge of the leaves, usually in the peak of the summer heat, or tip dieback of the tree, again, usually in the peak of the summer heat. Trees with this issue cannot complete necessary metabolic processes and tend to attract pests that inflict further stresses. A quick review of the literature indicates that many of the pests we see or expect to see on moisture-stressed trees include mites, ambrosia beetles, bark beetles, borers, armored scales, soft scales, pine wilt nematode, sawflies, and others. We can kill the pest, but it will only help the tree marginally at best, and definitely killing the pine wilt nematode in this pine tree is not going to bring this tree back. Where stem girdling roots form, we also see dead tissue and decay develop. So here on the top left, dead tissue at the base, this canker right here is due to the compressing effects of stem girdling roots. To its right is something we especially see a lot, and that's the winter injury of sun scald on moisture-stressed trees that I mentioned with our red maples earlier. And then at the bottom are a couple of photos showing how that dead tissue caused by stem girdling roots has progressed into decay that threatens the structure of the tree. These are both images of Katsura trees that we had to remove due to the effects of stem girdling roots and really advanced decay in those trees. One thing I'd like to highlight related to decay is many people attribute the decay at the base of the trees, usually underneath a mulch volcano, to that deep mulch itself. But there's not a lot of evidence that the mulch by itself causes these problems. In my experience, the decay is caused by a stem girdling root that is caused by the deep mulch. It's just that stem girdling root is hidden beneath the mulch volcano, so we blame the mulch itself. I pulled together some data from our campus about how these issues impact us, and we think we're really doing pretty well compared to a lot of the people around us. Over the last 4 years, we've removed 136 trees for being in poor condition. More than a quarter of those trees were directly due to this sort of interrelated complex of issues caused by nursery practices, mulching on the landscape, and how we plant our trees on the landscape. You can compare that to diseases. We removed a single tree, Dutch elm disease, or pests. We removed 9 trees due to emerald ash borer, really things that were pretty much not preventable. But you can see that, or you could say that with these numbers, our own garden maintenance practices, even as a well-known public garden, where we think we're doing most things right, are still our biggest pest and disease for our own trees. We can certainly frame it that way. So now that we've clearly defined the problem, how do we fix these issues? Here's the integrated pest management workflow again: monitor, prevent, control. First, monitoring. How can you identify trees that have these issues? Is there obvious soil or mulch covering the root flare, such as here? Do you see a collapsed root flare on one side of the tree where you would otherwise hope to see a root flaring out? Is it collapsed instead? Do you see obvious stem girdling roots above ground, such as here? Do you see signs of moisture stress, such as the leaf scorch here? Other signs might be sun scald on the southwest of the trunk, dieback in the tips of the tree, chlorosis or yellowing of the leaves. You might also, I don't have a photo of it here, but you may also see damage at the base of the tree. One aspect I'd particularly like to focus on is collapsed root flares. So oftentimes you don't need to dig up the tree to know exactly what's going on under the soil line. If you see a collapsed root flare on one side of the tree, such as here or here, or a collapsed root flare all the way around the entire tree, such as this poor tree, you can be pretty confident that you have a root problem that may or may not be fixable. And you can see that stem girdling root that's causing that collapsed flare here. As one of our staff noted after the talk last week, once you train yourself to see this on the landscape, looking at the world of urban trees becomes a lot more, I think, as she said, overwhelmingly sad. Again, these issues start as early as the nursery or the garden center, Wherever you buy your tree or shrub, whether it's a large wholesale nursery like this or a retail garden center, you should really try to find a well-defined and full root flare before adopting that tree or shrub as your own. You can see a photo of me digging to find that out at the nursery. So we spent a lot of time talking about what our root systems shouldn't look like, but what does the ideal root flare condition actually look like? It should look like one of these 5 trees here. Each of these trees is thriving. Should be pronounced, well-defined, vigorous root flare that is free of soil or mulch on top of it. What is the root flare exactly? Defining the root flare is a question that a lot of people seem to really struggle with, and really the literature and specifications don't seem to address very well. The rule that I would use is if you cannot tell exactly which direction these main structural roots are headed radially out from the base of the tree, then you're probably not looking at the root flare. So I think that's a really important point to make, as a lot of us struggle to find that root flare, is if you're not if you can't tell exactly which direction those main structural roots are headed radially out from the base of the tree, then you are not looking at the root flare. It's really important also to illustrate how difficult or impossible it would be for a circling root to find its way around the base of one of these trees at this point without running into a major obstruction pretty quickly, as you're going to run into another root before you're able to circle the base of this tree and cut off its vascular system. So now I want to pause. I've been talking a lot, so I want to get the audience involved for a bit. Before we get into practices to prevent and fix these issues, I have 5 quiz trees here that I think we should be able to, should have time to get through all of them. So Cindy, do we have the polls available?
We do, and I'm going to launch the very first one, which is, how do you assess this tree? Select all the options that apply, so it is multiple choice. What do you think is wrong with this tree? Is it too deeply planted, too much mulch, the mulch touching base of tree, or poor quality nursery tree? While they're voting, Jake, I have a question that I think might be timely for you to answer with this example. What is it about the deep planting and over mulching that causes the tree roots to circle? Are they just not able to grow in the correct direction through all the soil and mulch? So looks like we got a lot of votes in. I'm going to end the poll and share the results. And you see, most people think that it's too deeply planted.
And
okay.
We've got a good audience today that is listening. I would agree with our audience there that this tree is too deeply planted. The reason we know it's too deeply planted is because we can't see the flare as it emerges from the soil line. I do agree with everybody who also mentioned the mulch is touching the base of the tree. You could definitely select that one as well. Bottom line is, if we can't see the flare of the tree, we have an issue. Now, to answer the question that Cindy posed is, why do these trees develop these girdling roots? The quick answer is that trees will put roots wherever there is rootable soil, which may include decomposing mulch or mineral soil. And so when we plant our trees too deeply or put roots over or put mulch over the skinniest part of that flare, those roots will very quickly grow through that. And unfortunately, that conflicts with the radial growth of the tree, and they'll just eventually constrict that tree until it can't add additional sapwood and vascular tissue. So let's move to quiz tree number 2, Cindy.
Okay, will do. And you got to advance the slide. And now I'm going to.
All right, so while Cindy's bringing that up, I'll go ahead and read through it. Is assess this tree the same way. Is it too deeply planted? Is there too much mulch? Is there mulch touching the base of the tree? Is it a poor quality nursery tree, or is it planted just right? And as Cindy said, there's probably a couple different answers to most of these questions, but I'm hoping to zoom in on 1 or 2 answers.
Okay, I love the one that the question that just popped up, and I'll rat on you. Alex Denker ratted on you and told me how hard it is to find a tree that doesn't have circling roots, because Jake actually goes and he is very adamant about finding these good trees. So he takes his sharp knife with him and starts digging around the tree, the base of the tree, to find those girdling roots. So you're going to have a special relationship with the nurseries that you work with. Otherwise, I think that's why people think Jake is crazy. But
We'll
it looks like,
we'll we'll answer that question later.
okay. Looks like it got lots of good votes. How do you think? Or what do you think?
Let's bring up the results, Cindy.
Oh, yes, that's it. I can see him all the time. So there
All
you
right,
go.
and you guys are right on it. Yeah, this tree has a mix of too much mulch and mulch touching the base of the tree. With that mulch over the flare of the tree, surrounding the skinniest part of the tree, those roots will quickly find their way around the base of the tree, and this tree, the outlook for all three of these trees is not very good. So I will advance again to the third tree here.
And I'll
And
pull up the next poll.
again, is it too deeply planted? Does it have too much mulch? Is the mulch touching the base of the tree? Is it a poor quality nursery tree, or are there generally no major issues with this tree?
Oh, they're getting too smart. I can see what they're answering. Can you see it when they're voting, or is it you have to wait for the final reveal?
I can't see the votes, Cindy.
Okay, then I will surprise you, but they are getting smart.
All right,
So
let's bring it up
here we
then.
go. See how
All right,
smart they got?
I like it. Yeah, this is a tree that one of our gardeners, Matt Huber over at American History Museum, just knocked out of the park. You can see that flare above the mulch line. There were a few answers there. There's mulch touching the base of the tree, too much mulch. You could probably say that here, but this tree has a really good outlook because that flare is up above the soil and the mulch line. It's clearly visible.
Excellent. Okay,
We'll change
quiz
speeds.
number 4.
Yeah, here a little bit. We're gonna do it a little bit differently, but which set of trees is more likely to be healthy and successful? Those trees on the left or those trees on the right?
Oh, Jake, you're a good instructor. They are just clued in. I'm so glad everybody should see your presentation, and we'd have much healthier trees in our urban area. All right,
All
I'm
right.
going to end the poll and show you the results.
Yeah, great audience. Of course, and I should say the trees on the right are some of our iconic saucer magnolias. The trees on the right are healthy and thriving. The trees on the left don't look so good because, again, back in the 80s, before we knew better, we planted these a little bit too deeply, mulched them a little bit too heavily, and now they've got these large girdling roots either above or just below
And
the soil line.
right, and the magnolias are ornamental trees. They've asked, does this apply to small ornamental trees? Yes.
Absolutely, this applies to any woody plant with secondary growth. Of course, it's a lot large shade trees. We don't want to lose a huge shade tree to a stem girdling root. You know, if we lose a little shrub to a stem girdling root, not quite so concerned about that, right? But all plants are equally affected. All woody plants with secondary growth are equally affected, though some are more prone than others.
Right. So why are they thriving on the right?
So these trees are on the right are thriving because that root flare is visible to the air above, and there's no soil or mulch on top. That with that root flare being exposed, that means that roots cannot circle around the base and again constrict that vascular tissue that feeds the canopy from the roots.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, and our final quiz. Here we go.
All right, and same as the first three, is it too deeply planted? Is there too much mulch, or is there mulch touching the base of the tree? Is it a poor quality nursery tree, or are there no major issues?
Okay. I'm going to give it another minute. You've got so many questions coming up, but they're all cluing in that they need to really start looking at their trees. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll because they're getting the gist of what you're saying beautifully. So
yeah.
move this around.
I
There you
think
go.
I think everybody who answered this question got it right, but the primary issue here is that this is a poor quality nursery tree. We can see from the stakes in this photo that that this is a recently planted tree. We can also see that it has a big stem girdling root wrapped all the way around the base of the tree, despite the fact that we just recently planted it. That this tree was doomed the day it left the nursery. It should have never gone in the ground.
Okay, so I'm going to reiterate, this applies to all trees, correct? Conifers, ornamentals, big trees, little trees, whatever. These principles are the same for everybody, right?
Correct. Yeah. Well, some trees are going to be more prone to develop these. I see a lot of red maples, elms, ash trees seem to get stem girdling roots, whereas a lot of oaks don't seem to get them quite as bad. But any woody plant with secondary growth, so any woody plant that you can age by its rings, is going to have the same be prone to the same issues if we're planting too deeply, mulching too heavily over the flare, or we're just not spending the time at the nursery to try to make sure we're getting high quality trees.
Okay, now you're going to show us what we can do, right?
All
Because
right.
otherwise I'm going to go home depressed.
All right. I've spent 35 minutes talking about gloom and doom. So here we are. How can we fix these issues? How can we effectively assess, identify, and monitor for them? And how can we prevent these issues? So starting with plant selection and cultural practices. Plant selection, we have to get good trees and we have to select a site that works for them. So I'm going to focus mostly on nursery selection. This first bullet here, we want to make sure that every tree that shows up on our site, that shows up in our gardens, looks like the trees at the left. Whether it's a small one or a big one, we want to be able to see this root flare right here at the top of the root ball or the top of the container. How are we going to get that? Sylvia's tree tagging technique out at the wholesale nursery is great, but Mike here in the background is doing what it takes to get a good tree. He's down there with his soil knife, with the nursery manager's permission, looking to see if he can find a good high quality root flare in the nursery. So this is a slide that I prepared for our staff training when buying trees at the wholesale field nursery, but it mostly equally applies to the retail garden center. The bottom line is that you need to do as much as you can to find a tree where the root flare is visible, identifiable, and has at least 3 pronounced and well-distributed structural roots moving radially from the base of the tree. So ideally, you would want to see that at the soil line or at the top of the container, but sometimes you have to dig for it a little bit or a lot. Of course, as someone buying a tree from a retail garden center, I would seek to find that sort of overly helpful sales rep who will help you and give you permission to work into the top of the root ball a little bit and see if you can see what that root system looks like. It's my opinion that if enough consumers like us ask for the things that matter when buying trees, nurseries will eventually meet that demand. So to answer Alex's question from earlier, it's up to us to tell nurseries what's important to us, create that consumer demand for high quality trees. And again, with these root flare issues are in my opinion, and a lot of the literature shows, the single most important determinant of whether that tree succeeds or fails. We should be asking for high quality trees. Containerized trees and shrubs, most commonly in round black plastic containers. This is going to be something you see super commonly at the garden center. They're really convenient because they're light, they're easy to transport, and they establish quickly. They are also notorious for circling root systems. So here's tree number 1, tree number 2, a couple dead trees we pulled out of the ground with their root system in the shape of the container that doomed them. If you're buying trees or shrubs in a container, you should verify that roots are not excessively circling inside the container like this tree here. And I should say, I saw this at a nursery. They were not trying to sell this tree, but you can see how bad these issues can get. And then for every containerized tree and shrub that you plant, you should be shaving the edge of the root ball with a square tip spade or a similar tool to sever all those small circling roots around the inside of the container and get those cut root tips pointed outward radially from the base of the tree. So this is a really good graphic here too. Putting the right plant in the right site is obviously very important to that plant's health and is a crucial component of integrated pest management. I'm mostly going to skip this for today's talk, but we'll just say that certain sites encourage circling and stem girdling roots and other problems a lot more than others. Some of the easiest ways to prevent stem girdling roots are the cultural practices of how we maintain our trees on a daily basis. So, be lazy when digging your planting hole deep. It should be more of a wide divot. Instead, spend your energy here on the top of the root ball or the top of the container, pulling that soil and fine root mass off the top of the root flare instead. And then, of course, get your mulch donut right, wide, shallow, not touching the base of the tree. You should be able to see the flare, and it shouldn't be elevated above the flare here so that gravity will just pull it down onto the flare as soon as you walk away. So we'll start here just talking a little bit about tree and shrub planting and 2 steps. Step 1 of planting, it isn't intuitive. Almost everyone, including every single landscape contractor I've ever worked with, forgets this step. Pull open that burlap on top of your B&B tree, or start working your way through the fine roots and soil media of your containerized tree or shrub to find the true root flare of the tree, not the first set of roots, but the true root flare. Do what you have to do to find it. Here's Mike Allen, one of our horticulturists, after having pulled 15 inches of soil off the top of this B&B tree root ball. It's really frustrating to get something like this from the nursery. Francis doing the same thing on a lot higher quality tree here, using a trenching shovel. Probably not the best shovel, but it worked just fine here. And then, of course, here's a containerized tree up close where this graft union, this widening of the graft union was planted at soil level. But if you look for the root flare, it's 8 inches deep in the containerized tree, and there's all these fine roots that are already starting to circle the base of the tree and start to cut that off. So by finding this flare now at planting, not only do you get the tree planted the right height, but it also allows you to remove the inevitable set of circling and stem girdling roots that are already formed up here in the top of the root ball above the root flare. And then step 2, plant high enough. Again, we mentioned earlier that over 90% of, quote, professionally planted trees are planted too deeply. Here's step 2. Let's get that right as well. So most of the trees in our landscape look something like this, where the root flare is way down below the soil and the mulch line. We don't want to do that bad. But many planting details, a lot of tutorials you'll see online will have you planting with the root flare even with the soil line. And then when you put mulch up above that, that just kind of sloughs down here onto the root flare, and you end up with these same issues that cause these woody plant declines. So I really encourage, if you can, when I'm out planting trees with our staff, to get that root flare where the base of the tree widens into perceptible structural roots where you can see which direction they're pointed. Plant that up even with the top of the mulch line so that mulch can't fall on top and cause those roots to circle around, again, the skinniest part of the base of the tree here. And it is important to point out we're talking about the location of the root flare, that root structure. We're not talking about the top of the root ball or the top of the container. We should be planting the root flare itself up here near the top of the mulch line. Next comes mulching. Mulch should be 2 to 4 inches depth. It should not be touching the tree and not installed in a way that will eventually end up on top of the root flare of the tree. So it feels a little bit weird to do it this way because it's not what you see everywhere else on the landscape. But the bottom line here is if your mulch looks like what your neighbor's landscaper put down or what the shopping mall parking lot looks like, you're probably doing something wrong, unfortunately. Again, a comparison of mulch techniques. Over the last few years, I think we've seen a lot of people move from the tall mulch volcano like this to sort of the shorter, quote, shield volcano. But the result is the same. The development of circling and stem girdling roots in the soil and mulch above the flare causes woody plant decline. So unless the root flare is free of mulch, such as here, and free of mulch piled above it that will just fall down onto it, unless that happens, the mulch is just creating tree health issues rather than solving them and helping your tree as it is supposed to do. So with prevailing planting, nursery, and mulching practices leaving us with a huge number of trees already declining or likely to decline, what is the best way to fix these issues? Here's a few slides breaking it down to easy, moderate, and difficult techniques. So start with the easy stuff first. With the number of damaged trees in our landscapes, the sort of legacy of deep planting and overmulching is definitely a marathon, not a sprint. So start with the easy trees. All you need is a rake, some hand pruners, maybe a trowel. Just pull that mulch back off the base of your trees and then remove these little pencil-sized circling roots that have occurred over the years. See if you can find a flare without too much work. Sometimes it's not that far down. A lot of these easy fixes of just destroying mulch volcanoes and pulling back the mulch to find the flare and save our woody plants is something that you yourself probably can and should be doing in the landscape you manage. Again, whether it's a single urban tree box full of pansies and a street tree, or a large public institutional space full of mature trees. But it is definitely something that people will see and ask questions about. So here's my challenge to our audience. Please share your progress. Use social media to spread awareness to your social networks, and tag us in your before or after photos of destroying mulch volcanoes like we've showed here. We hope to reshare a few of these. So Smithsonian Gardens on Instagram, catch our attention with hashtag root flare challenge. Again, we'd love to see all of you experiment with pulling the mulch back off the top of the root flare and seeing what you find underneath. So now we're going to move on past the easy trees, and there are a lot of these in our landscape. Once you get those easy trees out of the way, start scheduling a few manual root collar excavations. Again, this is something that most gardeners can and should be doing in the landscapes that we manage. But proceed with caution. When you start cutting roots and removing that sort of rich mix of mulch and soil, you are taking away resources that your damaged tree may depend on, at least the short-term future. So for this, maybe add a soil knife, a hand cultivator, large loppers to your toolbox, and start digging into the soil and find root mass covering your tree's root flares. Again, use caution, move slowly, maybe do it over several years. You are removing roots that do support the tree. So a general rule of thumb is that you can remove roots equivalent to about 20 to 25% of the trunk cross-sectional area for a tree that is otherwise healthy. But again, where you don't have to do all that at once, it can be done over several years. So here's a quick time-lapse video of a manual root collar excavation. I think we did this last week or the week before on a American holly over at our Natural History Museum. So hopefully the video is playing here and you can see us start just using hand pruners, soil knife, hand cultivator, just pulling that mulch and soil back off the top of this root flare of this little holly, and probably been planted about 5 years ago. And it already developed pretty dense mat of fine fibrous roots above the top of the root flare. Certainly would have been a lot easier to do this when we planted it. Even on that tree that wasn't really that bad off, we removed a half a cubic yard of soil and mulch from above its root flare. And then as you can see with this after photo, the critical piece here is that this root flare, this widening of the tree that prevents roots from circling, is up above that mulch line of freshly mulched and freshly edged area here. And finally, more difficult fixes. We've done a lot of work at Smithsonian Gardens with air excavation to find those root flares and remove stem girdling roots, high volume airstream to move the soil but not damage the roots. Certainly dirty, labor intensive work that requires specialized and sometimes more dangerous tools and or significant resources to implement. But sometimes it's worth it to save an important tree. As with the previous practice, use caution, and with this one especially, it's important to involve a certified arborist. There's certainly potential to cause health and structural damage to the trees, and with some of these tools, you need training and experience to use them safely as well. So here's Joe Bryce, one of our gardeners, in action using the air spade to uncover the root flare of this tree that was over mulched, and you can see how these small roots grew through that mulch layer and started to constrict around the base of the tree. Once we moved that soil and got these roots, you can see we just cut them off. And now, as long as we don't over apply mulch again, this flare will remain above the soil and mulch line and protect itself from being constricted by stem girdling roots. So it looks like I'm running a little bit low on time, so I'm going to skip through a couple slides here, but I do want to say that with all of the legacy issues in our landscape related to stem girdling roots and planting, mulching, and nursery issues, there's sometimes less than straightforward situations where it's more of an art of choosing the least worst case scenario than it is a science of saving every last one of our trees. This large stem girdling root at the left is kind of a no-win situation. This tree is very likely headed down, but this tree on the right has very easily has stem girdling roots all the way around it that can be easily removed with some loppers. And so by addressing these now, we do this tree pretty well before these issues become unfixable later. There are a lot of examples of really difficult ways to save existing trees on our landscape. So I'll skip through a couple of those examples to round back to our conclusions, which is our first primary conclusion that I want you to take home today is that planting, nursery, and mulching practices, that interrelated complex of practices together, is responsible for an epidemic of woody plant decline caused by stem girdling roots on our landscape. Our second conclusion is that managing the root flare, keeping it free of soil and mulch, and circling stem girdling roots is critical to integrated pest management and critical to responsible use of pesticides on the landscape. Make sure you're addressing the problem causing tree health issues, not the symptom of those tree health issues. Third, mulch kills trees, plain and simple, as it is used on our landscape in the vast majority of cases today. Mulch according to best practices, push that mulch wide, keep it shallow, and keep it off the flare of the tree. Do not mimic what your neighbor is doing. Do not try to look like the rest of the neighborhood. Our fourth conclusion is deep planting kills trees. Make sure you get them planted high enough and gauge that height by the root flare itself, not the top of the root ball or the top of the container. Our fifth conclusion is that many nursery grown trees and shrubs have poor root systems. Avoid those defects where you can. When you can't avoid them, correct them. And as we kind of brought up earlier, make sure that you state your preferences to the nursery so they know there's consumer demand for these high quality root systems. And then our sixth conclusion is that these issues they're a little bit overwhelming, but they can be prevented and corrected with small changes to our habits. It's going to take a long time, but we can prevent and correct these issues. So start early. Start with the rake and the hand pruners early, rather than the air spade and the hard labor later in the tree's life. So with that, I will conclude with this sort of summary of 5 things to break our old bad habits. Is number 1, purchase good trees with good root systems. Number 2, find the flare, fix those root problems when you're buying and planting trees. 3, make sure you plant your trees high enough. 4, create a wide, shallow mulch donut. Make sure you don't volcano it around the flare in any way. And then 5, talk about what you're doing and why you're doing it, which gets to, again, I'd like to remind you, we'd love to see what you're doing on your landscape to keep the mulch off the flares. So you can see a live example of our Smithsonian Gardens Root Flare Challenge, and we'd love to see yours on Instagram as well. Thank you. Cindy, let's open it up to questions, and it looks like we've got more than we can answer in 5 or 10 minutes.
We do, but I want to remind everybody, this video will be posted on our website next week. The other good thing about this, we will answer a lot of the questions, and if you've never visited our website before, to find out that we do answer these questions, and that will be on the resource page that goes right below the video when we post it on our website. So if you don't hear it here, go back to our website, find out some of these answers to be able to solve your problems. But I'll ask the very number 1, should we just not use mulch?
So mulch used in the correct way is something that is very beneficial to our trees. There's been a little bit of research done about, maybe we should just give up on mulch and not use it at all. I prefer no mulch to bad mulch, but I prefer good mulch to no mulch.
Okay. Do you prefer ground covers to mulch? Should we worry about ground covers being right up against the base of a tree, or loose leaves like there are in the forest, or compost?
I think from a tree's perspective, probably a mulched ground plane free of plants is going to be the best sort of soil situation for the trees. But I know we use perennial plantings, less aggressive perennial plantings, to actually protect our soils from other uses, such as pedestrians stomping through the root system. So I think it depends on situation, but the main point here is that we need to do as much as we can to keep whatever that may be, from accumulating over the top of the root flare and causing roots to circle the base of the tree.
Okay, I live in a townhouse, so I have trees planted in containers. Should I lift my tree occasionally and shave roots off of it so it doesn't get a girdling root? Or what's the best practice?
Uh, there's a little bit of a tougher question. I think it really depends on what your goal is. I think you can expect that any woody plant in a container um, is uh, um, is going to develop or in a round plastic container is going to develop a circling root system. So if you're and this probably goes back to our considerations of how do we treat our shrubs when we plant them. If your time frame for that containerized plant is 5 or 10 years and you expect to throw it away before it starts to decline, or plant it somewhere else, then maybe don't worry about those issues. But if you're really invested in keeping that tree for the long term, I think it's a matter of before it gets root bound, pulling it out of its pot and correcting those roots, which may include shaving the edge of the root ball, and then up potting it so it has a soil volume that it could extend those new roots into. So not as much of a containers or an interior scapes guy as an outdoor tree guy, but I think that that logic stays sound if you take that approach.
Okay, thank you. Okay, bad mulch. What is bad mulch? I think
Oh,
bad mulch.
all right, yeah, and I love this question. So bad mulch is any mulch that is applied over the top of the root flare of the tree, and again, any mulch that is applied over the top of the root flare is going to allow those roots to circle the base of the tree where it is skinniest, and then those will develop into circling and stem girdling roots with time. So if you leave that flare exposed, those primary structural roots act as an obstruction to other roots circling the base of the tree. So drawing back to that image of that gigantic tulip poplar in the middle of the woods, is with the root flare that was 15 feet wide. There is no way for any root tip on that tree to find its way to circle the base of the tree, unless of course we were to pile a big old pile of mulch or soil or a combination of the two on top of that just enormous root flare.
Okay, I have two questions to end up with. One is just fun. Should we wait to plant our trees in the fall because this year we're getting the 17-year cicada crop or whatever you say? What do you think? Should we wait to fall or should we just plant and stand out there and guard our trees?
I know that we're not waiting till fall to plant our trees, but maybe we've dialed it down a little bit till fall. So it really depends, but I would definitely not avoid, if my options were to plant a tree now or not plant it at all, I would plant it now. But it is worth mentioning to a bunch of tree people that fall is a great time to plant trees on the landscape as well. You get root growth for most of that time from September to June, when the trees are not under heat and moisture stress. So it really gives them a lot of time to get the roots underneath them. Um, Whereas if you plant them in the spring, they've only got a couple months before they're subjected to all that heat. Now, some of our trees do have issues. If we dig them out of the field in the fall, they don't have quite as good a survivability. But if you can grab a tree that's been out of the ground since the spring or in a container and plant it in the fall, you're going to have a lot of time for that root system to get established before all those evapotranspirational demands come June, July, August of the next year.
Okay, thank you. And this is the last one because I know the first time I saw this presentation, I was so depressed. I ran out and I started hugging all the trees in my neighborhood because I could see them dying one by one. You're not meaning for us to get depressed, right?
I want to give you the tools to start to fix these issues today.
Yes.
It can be very overwhelming, and there are a lot of trees on our landscape that we've said these issues are too advanced. We're gonna focus on the most important trees first, and that means sometimes letting some of our lower quality declining trees go. But the important part is that we make sure we don't. As with the case of the urban red maple, let's not continue to make the same mistakes over and over. Let's put trees in the ground that we expect to last rather than 8 or 10 years until they keel over from a stem girdling root. Let's put trees in the ground that we expect and know will last 80 or 100 years and really provide us a beautiful tree that provides just a huge number of benefits over its lifetime.
I agree. Thank you so much, Jake. We really appreciate this information. And remember, this will be on a video. You can share it with your friends. Don't go and tell those landscapers what to do. Kindly suggest that they learn new techniques and practices. We don't want to have a bad name out there. Well, Jake told me I had to do this. Remember, be polite, be kind, and be green. Thank you all for attending. We appreciate your attendance. We appreciate your support, and we'll be glad to see you next week. Good afternoon.